Welcome, everyone, to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into something central for Catholics, something huge, the Mass. We'll be tracing its journey, from ancient traditions right up to the forms we see today. We've got some great source material guiding us, and our aim here is to give you a solid grasp of the changes, the debates, and maybe what authentic worship looks like going forward. This deep dive should help answer some pretty big questions, too, questions you might have thought about yourself. Like, first, how can a pope say something is perpetual, like the Tridentine Mass, but then later popes change it? What does that mean for papal authority? Second, we know the Novus Ordo Mass, the one most common today, is valid, but is just being valid enough? Is it really sustaining deep Catholic life generation after generation? And third, what's the real story, historically and theologically, behind these big liturgical shifts? And crucially, what do the sources suggest as, the way forward? It's going to be quite a journey, linking history to today's faith. And hey, if you want to go even deeper after this, check out www.epistles.online. It's got a ton of analysis and context that really helped shape our discussion. So to get a handle on today's situation, we really need to go back, way back to 1570. That's the year of Pope St. Pius V and his really foundational document, Quo Primum.
Exactly. And this wasn't just some minor update. This was huge. It was right after the Council of Trent, which itself was a massive response to the Protestant Reformation. So Quo Primum had a very specific job to do. Pope St. Pius V was trying to standardize the Roman Rite. Over the centuries, lots of local variations had popped up. He wanted to clear those out, mostly. Though he did make an exception, it's important to note, for rites that were genuinely ancient, proven to be over 200 years old. But the main thrust was standardization, formally establishing what we now call the Tridentine Mass. And the goal wasn't just neatness, it was about unity in worship, theological clarity, and making sure there was a clear link back to Apostolic Tradition. Especially in that era of religious turmoil, safeguarding the Mass was paramount.
Right, that makes a lot of sense given the context. So Quo Primum wasn't just a suggestion. Let's unpack this. What were the absolute core directives from Pope St. Pius V? What did it actually say?
Well, it's incredibly specific, almost like a legal document for the liturgy. The sources point to several key things. First, the absolute main goal, the preservation of a pure liturgy. This was directly aimed at stopping liturgical abuses or variations that might confuse doctrine. And to get there, he ordered a massive restoration of the Missal. This wasn't just proofreading. He got learned scholars to dig through ancient manuscripts, old codices, writings of the Church Fathers. The whole point was to get the Roman Missal back to its most original, authentic form as they understood it then.
Okay, so restore it first, then what?
Then, universal adoption. This was pretty radical for the time. He ordered it to be used everywhere in the Latin Church.
Yeah.
Provinces, dioceses, parishes, monasteries, military orders, private chapels, everywhere. No more local customs unless they had that 200-year pedigree.
Wow. So one size fits all, essentially.
Pretty much. And it was about strict exclusivity. He explicitly abolished other missals, again, apart from the very old ones. And crucially, he forbade anyone from adding, omitting, or changing anything in his newly promulgated Roman Missal. This wasn't just for parish priests either. It included authority and obedience. All clergy, bishops, cardinals, everyone were bound to use this missal and only this missal. It was a strong assertion of central control.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me, especially considering later history.
Ah, yes, the perpetual permission and protection. This is probably the most debated part today. Pius V stated very clearly that this missal could be used freely and lawfully forever, without any fear of penalty, judgment, or coercion. That's a direct quote, basically. He even said, no one whosoever is to be forced or compelled to alter this missal, and that no one could revoke or modify the document.
Forever. No modification.
That's what the language suggests, and he backed it up. There were specific penalties for violation, losing property, hefty fines for printers who messed it up, even excommunication. And he ended Quo Primum with this incredibly solemn divine warning. Basically, anyone daring to alter the decree would incur the wrath of Almighty God and of the blessed apostles Peter and Paul.
Wow, wrath of God. That is intense. You can see why people would think this was absolutely set in stone. So given that incredibly strong language, perpetual, no one could revoke, wrath of God, the big question is, how on earth did the Roman Missal get revised later on? How did we end up with the Novus Ordo? It seems like a direct contradiction.
It seems like one, absolutely. And that's the crux of the issue. It leads us to a really vital distinction in church law. Quo Primum, despite its incredibly strong language, falls into the category of discipline, not faith and morals.
Okay, explain that difference. Discipline versus doctrine.
Right. The Church teaches infallibly only when defining doctrines concerning faith or morals. These are truths revealed by God, considered unchangeable. Think of the Creed, Marian dogmas, things like that. Liturgical laws, however, are at how we worship, the structure, the prayers, the rubrics. While they absolutely protect and express doctrine, the laws themselves are disciplinary. They govern the Church's practice. And disciplinary laws, even those issued by a pope with the strongest possible wording, are not immutable in the same way doctrine is.
So a pope can't bind future popes on disciplinary matters, even if he says forever.
Exactly. Each pope has the authority and sometimes the responsibility to adapt disciplinary laws for the pastoral needs of the Church in his own time. Interpreting Quo Primum as an unchangeable dogmatic decree misunderstands the limits of papal authority regarding discipline.
Okay, that's a key distinction. Is there historical evidence for this, for popes changing things after Pius V?
Oh, absolutely. History clearly shows this understanding in practice. Long before Vatican II, popes revised the Missal of Pius V. Pope Clement VIII made revisions in 1604. Pope Urban VIII followed with more edits in 1634. Then you have St. Pius X in 1911, making significant changes to the breviary and rubrics. Pius XII revised the Holy Week rites quite substantially in 1955. And Pope John XXIII issued a revised missal in 1962, the one often used just before the Novus Ordo, which included adding St. Joseph's name to the canon.
So changes happened, but maybe not as drastic.
Generally, yes.
Yeah.
Those revisions are usually seen as preserving the core structure and, let's say, the spirit of the Tridentine Rite. They were adjustments, restorations, updates within the same fundamental framework. The understanding was always that Quo Primum provided stability after Trent, but wasn't an eternally binding law in every single detail. It wasn't until 1969, with Pope Paul VI, that we saw the promulgation of the Novus Ordo Missae, the new order of the Mass, and that, by most accounts, represented a much more significant shift in language, form, and even emphasis compared to its predecessors.
Right. And that brings us closer to today, where this whole issue of the Mass is still very much alive, isn't it? We've seen quite different approaches, even from recent popes.
We certainly have. The contrasting approaches really shine a light on the ongoing discussions and, frankly, tensions within the Church about liturgy. Yet Pope Benedict XVI, back in 2007, issued his motu proprio, Summorum Pontificum. Remember, a motu proprio is something a pope issues on his own initiative. And with Summorum Pontificum, he essentially reauthorized wider use of the 1962 Tridentine Missal. He called it the extraordinary form of the Roman Rite, alongside the Novus Ordo as the ordinary form.
His idea was coexistence, recognizing its value.
Exactly. He spoke about its spiritual value for many people and wanted to make it more available, hoping it would foster reconciliation. His famous line was something like, "What earlier generations held as sacred remains sacred and great for us too."
Okay, but then Pope Francis took a different approach.
Yes. In 2021, Pope Francis issued Traditionis Custodes. This document placed significant restrictions on celebrating the older Mass, the extraordinary form. His stated reasons centered on concerns about unity. He argued that the permissions granted by Benedict were being used by some to undermine the Second Vatican Council and the legitimacy of the Novus Ordo itself. So he emphasized the Novus Ordo as the unique, single expression of the Roman Rite today, and aimed to sort of steer everyone back towards that for unity's sake.
It's fascinating how these different approaches highlight these ongoing tensions, isn't it? Tradition, reform, unity.
Absolutely. And despite the restrictions from Traditionis Custodes, the sources we looked at point out that the Tridentine Mass hasn't disappeared. It is celebrated by a smaller number, yes, but it endures, kept alive by certain priests, communities, and lay faithful who find deep spiritual connection there in its tradition, its silence, its particular expression of reverence.
So this leads us right to the heart of the matter for today. What does all this history mean for the Novus Ordo as it's experienced now, especially thinking about its long-term effect on Catholic faith and life? We've talked about the changes, but is it, working for the long haul?
That's a million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And this is where the source material moves from history to a kind of critical assessment of the present. First things first.
Mm.
The Novus Ordo Missae is absolutely valid. Let's be crystal clear. The consecration happens. The Eucharist is real. Christ is truly present. There's no theological doubt about its sacramental validity.
Okay. Validity is not the issue.
Correct. But the sources argue something else, something really thought-provoking. They say that while it's valid, the Novus Ordo, as commonly practiced, suffers from a certain vulnerability.
Vulnerability. What does that mean in this context?
It means that validity alone might not be enough to sustain vibrant Catholic life across generations. The vulnerability, as argued in the material, comes from a perceived shift in emphasis within the Novus Ordo structure. The focus, often with good intentions like making it more accessible or communal, has sometimes shifted heavily towards the congregation, the community aspect. And the potential downside, the argument goes, is that this can sometimes happen at the expense of fostering that deep, awe-inspiring reverence and emphasizing the absolute primacy of God in the act of worship. It's described as a subtle shift, maybe from a primarily God-centered, theocentric focus to a more human-centered, anthropocentric one in practice.
Okay, I think I see the distinction if we connect this to the bigger picture. What has this shift led to, according to the sources? What are the consequences they point out?
Well, the consequences outlined are pretty serious and sobering. This shift, they argue, has unfortunately opened the door in many places to liturgical abuses, sometimes quite significant ones. It's also led to more casual, sometimes even sloppy or irreverent celebrations of the Mass. There's often a feeling, the sources suggest, that the sense of the sacred, that palpable feeling of encountering the divine mystery, has been diminished in many parishes.
And this affects people's faith.
That's the core argument. This loss of the sacred, this weakening of reverence, has contributed to a weakening of Catholic identity itself. The evidence cited includes things we see around us: falling Mass attendance in many Western countries, a dramatic drop in vocations to priesthood and religious life, and perhaps most alarmingly, surveys showing a decline in belief among Catholics, even regular Mass-goers, in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, especially among younger people.
So the argument is validity is essential. But if the way Mass is celebrated doesn't consistently inspire awe or deep prayer, it struggles to pass on the faith effectively.
Precisely. It's not just about whether the sacrament happens, but whether the entire liturgical experience effectively forms people, draws them into the mystery, and sustains robust Catholic life over time.
Right. Given these really significant challenges and looking at the state of the Church today, what do the sources suggest needs to happen? What's the proposed path forward to, well, fix this?
The sources are quite direct, even urgent on this point. They argue that the current crisis won't be solved just by carrying on with the Novus Ordo exactly as it's often celebrated now. The solution proposed is a conscious effort to lead Catholics back towards more authentic, reverent worship. This doesn't necessarily mean scrapping the Novus Ordo entirely, but rather reforming it, making it more reverent, bringing its practice closer in spirit and form to the richness found in the traditional Latin Mass.
Okay, so reform the Novus Ordo. What would that look like specifically? What elements need restoring?
The material highlights several key elements. One is restoring periods of silence within the Mass, allowing space for personal prayer, for awe, rather than constant talking, singing, or activity. Another is encouraging ad orientem celebration, where the priest and people face the same direction, towards the liturgical east, towards God, during the liturgy of the Eucharist. This physically orients the focus on God, not on the community looking at itself or the priest. There's also a call to reintroduce the appropriate use of Latin, even if not for the whole Mass, and Gregorian chant. These are seen as parts of the Church's heritage that foster a sense of the sacred and universal. But overall, it's about cultivating a much deeper, palpable sense of the holy, the transcendent, within the liturgy itself, helping people really feel they are participating in something otherworldly.
And what if this doesn't happen? What are the stakes?
The sources suggest the stakes are very high. If bishops and leaders don't embrace this kind of liturgical renewal, the demographic trends look pretty grim, especially in the West. Catholicism could continue to shrink, becoming more of a minority faith, like we've seen happen in historically Catholic countries in Europe. It really poses a stark question for us. Can we afford to ignore these signs, or is courage needed to address the way we worship? The ultimate conclusion from the source material is quite powerful. Only by recovering this deep reverence, this God-centered focus in our worship, can the Church truly hope to endure, to thrive, and ultimately to grow again and fulfill her mission.
That really is a powerful conclusion. It makes you think. The history of the Mass, it's not just about old rules or documents, is it? It really touches the heart of how we connect with God. So maybe a final thought for you, listening in. Reflecting on all this, what steps, even small ones, might you take in your own spiritual life to cultivate a deeper sense of reverence when you participate in the Mass? It's not just theory, it impacts our faith directly. This has been a fascinating deep dive, tracing the Mass's evolution and looking honestly at its impact today. We've covered a lot: papal authority, validity versus vulnerability, paths for renewal, And again, if you want to explore all this much further, with all the historical details and theological arguments laid out, do visit www.epistles.online. Epistles is a really valuable resource, especially if you're looking for a perspective that tries to be balanced, neither rigidly traditionalist nor simply accepting modernist trends uncritically. The author directly takes on the challenges facing the church today. He openly tackles things like clericalism, liberalism, modernism, all the issues that contribute to the current crisis of faith, and he really strives to offer clarity. So we'd warmly invite you to support his apostolate if you can. Through prayers, by sharing the posts you find helpful, or by subscribing. It all helps keep this important work going and freely available. Thank you so much for joining us today for this deep dive into the heart of Catholic worship.